Bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour. Bonjour tout le monde.
Just gonna wait a few minutes as usual. I have everyone on mute just for background noise, just for now.
Mm-hmm.
Get started in just a minute or two. Well, bonjour everyone, bienvenue, and welcome to Demystifying the French with author Janet Hulstrand. Janet will tell the story of how a lifelong love of the French language inspired the journey that led from her home in Minnesota along a winding path that passed through Paris, New York City, and Washington, D.C., and led eventually to a beautiful little village in southern Champagne that was the beloved summer home of the Renoir family. She will also read from her recent book, Demystifying the French, How to Love Them and Make Them Love You, and take questions. Aimed at first-time visitors to France as well as expatriates, Demystifying the French is designed to help readers avoid common mistakes and get off on the right foot with the French. Hulstrand writes frequently for Bonjour Paris, France Today, France Revisited, and her blog, Writing from the Heart, Reading from the Road. Since 1997, she has taught Paris, a literary adventure, for the Education Abroad programs at Hunter and Queens Colleges of the City University of New York. She also teaches literature and culture classes at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., and has led book groups at the American Library in Paris. She is currently working on her next book, A Long Way from Iowa, a memoir. So Janet, welcome, and merci beaucoup for joining us on a Sunday from France.
Well, merci à vous for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I grew up in Minnesota. I think you just said that. And so it's great to be talking to a Midwestern audience. I've never actually been to Milwaukee. I've been through Wisconsin, driving from the East Coast to home in Minnesota hundreds of times. But Milwaukee's kind of off to the corner a little bit. So I haven't actually ever been there, but I'm thrilled to be here today. And I think I just did a Zoom talk a week ago with the Fédération, the National Alliance Française, in which I did all of what Erin was just saying. I sort of told the whole story of the path that got me interested in France, and eventually where I am now. I'm living in this little village in southern Champagne. So if you want to, but we sort of decided for today to focus on the book. And I will read you a little bit more than I was able to do last week because I took up a lot of last week telling my story. If you want to hear that story and see pictures, you can, I don't know, maybe Erin afterward, you can send everybody the link to that because it's now up on YouTube. So it's all there. And, but I thought we would maybe go straight to, I think Aaron asked that I could go straight to the book. And I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the book, and then I'll be happy to take your questions or comments. By way of introduction to the book, the reason I wrote the book really is that since 1997, I have been teaching this class in Paris every summer to City University of New York students. And through the years, I watched them struggle much in the same way I first struggled when I came to France. And I'll actually, the first excerpt I'm going to read you explains a little bit what that struggle was. But I saw them having trouble in France because there were just these sort of basic rules of etiquette that they didn't know. And those basic rules of etiquette are really important in France. But the problem is, there's no way to know them unless you know them, unless you grow up French or somebody tells you. And so I would see Americans, either my students, once I knew what those rules were, I tried to orient my students and let them know too. But I would see Americans come into a cafe or something and sort of get off on a bad start. And things would not go well. And I thought that was really too bad. So I guess I'll read the first. So what I did is I wrote this book, which is really divided into two parts. The first part is called Essential Tips for Even the Briefest of Encounters. And in there, I put 5 tips that I thought would be really useful for, suppose somebody's coming to France for the first time, they've never been there, they don't really know anything about it. What are 5 really important things that would be helpful to them in getting things off to a smooth start instead of a rough or awkward start? And then in the second half of the book, I wanted to write, it's more an appreciation of the French. What I have experienced over the years coming here, spending as much time as I can, really, for more than 40 years. And, meeting lots of people who some people even who are living here, whether they're British or Americans, and who are sort of complaining about the French a lot. They're living here, so obviously they've found things that they like. But they're always saying, why are they this way? Why are they that way? Why do they do this? And so the second half of the book is really, from my point of view, trying to explain how I see it, to explain some of these behaviors or attitudes or perspectives that can be difficult for people who are not French. So I'll read you the first tip for the first part of the book, and then I'm going to read one of the chapters from the second part of the book. And so the first tip is tip number 1. Instead of smiling, say bonjour. When I was first visiting and then living for short periods of time in France many years ago, I spent a lot of time walking out of the little shops in the small town outside of Paris where I was staying, wondering what I had done wrong. I knew, I sensed strongly that I had done something wrong, but I really couldn't imagine what it was. I always tried my best to smile nicely, to say please and thank you, and to use the very best French that I could. But all of that wasn't enough, it seemed. Then, many years later, a friend gave me the gift of Polly Platt's book, French or Faux, ? And voila, all of a sudden I knew. And believe it or not, this is what I had been doing wrong. 9 times out of 10, I had not been starting out by saying bonjour. Who could have imagined how important this small thing to me could be to the French? Well, let me tell you, it's important and it matters. And it's not a small thing to them. Tip number 1 is the most important thing anyone going to France can possibly know. Saying bonjour before you say anything else will make more of a difference in how well you are treated there and the quality of your social interactions in France than most Americans would believe possible. And it's so very easy to do. It's even better to say bonjour, madame, or bonjour, monsieur, or bonjour, messieurs, mesdames. My friend Penelope Rallins explains this by saying that these words are an instant mark of respect and people will respond accordingly. You shouldn't forget to also say merci and au revoir as you are leaving, especially if you ever wish to return to the same shop or see that person again. It is really hard for Americans to understand how very important this simple act can be. But really, remembering to properly greet and say goodbye to the people that you encounter in your daily interactions in France is incredibly important. This means everyone. The person you ask for directions on the street, the monsieur or madame at the drive-through window in a McDonald's, bus drivers. It's just part of treating someone like being a human being in France. Americans tend to smile at strangers as a way of conveying the information that we are friendly, polite people who mean no harm. But this smiling at a stranger does no good at all in France because smiling has an entirely different meaning there, as Polly Platt explained so well in French or Faux. In that book, she quoted her French son-in-law expressing a typical French point of view on the matter. When I'm introduced to another man, if he smiles, then I think to myself one of three things. He's making fun of me, he's hypocritical, or he's very stupid. If it's a woman, there's a fourth possibility. She wants to flirt. One of the students in one of my classes who has spent a great deal of time in France said that to a French person, forgetting to say bonjour is almost like a slap in the face. It's that bad. So if you can manage to remember to begin each social interaction in France with a proper greeting, bonjour, monsieur, and end the encounter with a proper farewell, au revoir, madame, you will find yourself feeling instantly and astonishingly more at ease in France, while also contributing to an improvement in the reputation of Americans in France. Not bad for a few simple little words. Here's the thing. Despite knowing all this for at least 20 years now, I still make the mistake of forgetting to start with bonjour fairly often. But I have found that when you forget, usually one of two things will happen. The French person may completely ignore your faux pas, but they probably won't be able to think less of you for it. Or they may correct you. The way they correct you is by pausing, giving you a hard, level stare, and then saying, bonjour, drawing out the second syllable nice and long. I would loosely translate this as, I think you forgot something important. How about we back up? I have found that the best thing to do in this case is to instantly and sincerely apologize and try to make up for it by saying, oui, bonjour, monsieur, je suis désolé, j'ai oublié. When it happens with someone I know, they're more likely to give me a kind of really look. And as soon as I see that look, I realize I've forgotten again. So I just apologize sincerely and more or less profusely, using plenty of body language, hands in an I surrender pose, abject posture, etc., to show I really mean it. Je suis désolé, I forgot. You know, it's because I'm American. Then they smile, they understand, and they forgive. They do. So that's tip number one. And then I thought for from the second part of the book, I'm going to read from a chapter called The Incomprehensible Appeal of the Negative. And I'm not going to give any more introduction than that. We'll have plenty of time to talk about it. One of the things that especially Americans tend to notice about the French right away is that they seem to approach almost every situation in a negative manner. C'est impossible, c'est pas possible, they cry. Or when they're a bit more willing to admit there might be a chance, a very, very small chance of success, they might say, often with a deep sigh, c'est pas évident. Through the years, I've heard many anecdotes and expressions of amazement by Americans that things that are so very clearly not only impossible, but are very, very, very possible, and in fact, sometimes downright easy, are dismissed out of hand as being impossible by the French. Recently, a friend who was coming to visit me in the small French village where I now live recounted such an incident. In asking me what I found so charming about the French, he said, "But they seem to always start from the position that everything is impossible." When I smiled and agreed with him, he told me how just then, as his and his friends were trying to find their way to my house, they had stopped and asked someone for directions. He then mimicked a dramatic demonstration of the impossibility of the situation this Frenchman believed my friends were in. All exaggerated Gallic shrugs, incredulous puffs of breath, and exasperated shakes of the head. My American friend had concluded his story by saying, "And then, after all that, he just pointed at the next road and said, 'Turn right up there.'" The French are the only people I know of who have a negative way of saying yes, says another friend. And although that description is not entirely accurate, it's true that when you ask someone a question in French that is posed in a negative way, for example, "You don't happen to have a pen, do you?" the way to answer yes is not oui, but si. It's just one of those funny little details about the French language that allows you to feel very satisfied with yourself when you manage to get the hang of it and remember to answer si in most, if not all, situations where it is called for. The most important thing to know about this negativity of the French is discussed in a most helpful way in Julie Barlow and Jean-Benoit Nadeau's book, The Bonjour Effect. In the chapter tellingly titled Finding the Yes in No, they say that the French say no, quote, everywhere, all the time. They say no when they mean yes, and they say no when they want you to think they might eventually say yes. The trick is in understanding the many things no can actually mean. Shortly after reading this, I realized what I had done wrong in a certain situation. It had to do with the very new, in France, concept of taking uneaten food away with you when you leave a restaurant. The doggy bag concept was until recently never practiced in France, and it was in fact considered bad manners to ask to bring food home. In France, you are supposed to enjoy your meal, appreciate it thoroughly, and finish it in a very leisurely way. You are not supposed to leave half of it on the plate and then ask to take some home with you. However, in keeping with the growing concern in France to minimize food waste, in 2016, it actually became law that restaurant owners have to comply when they are asked to wrap something up for a customer and send it home with them. So when I had a meal out with a bunch of friends and I really could not finish my very tasty meal, I thought I would try to get over my decades-old training in not asking to take it home and simultaneously test the new law. When the waiter, who was giving me plenty of time to enjoy and finish my meal, finally came and motioned to my still pretty full plate, I asked him if I could take it home with me. Je peux pas, madame, j'ai pas les moyens. I can't, ma'am. I don't have any way to do that, he said with a dismissive toss of his head, adding one of those no-can-do Gallic shruggings of the shoulder for good measure. What did I do? I instantly retreated into my default do not make a fuss Midwestern mentality and meekly accepted the verdict, though I was truly annoyed. I knew it was the law, and I knew it was perfectly possible for him to find a way to send the food home with me. The French are nothing if not creative and resourceful. And I had really been looking forward to having a very fine lunch of my leftovers the next day. It was only the next day, around lunchtime, that the light bulb went on in my head and I remembered Barlow and Nadeau. When the French vehemently disagree with something, it doesn't mean the conversation is over, they say. It's more like a conversation starter, a bargaining position, or an invitation to make a counteroffer. The mistake is to consider no a stone wall when it actually operates like a trampoline. How right they are. I realized in retrospect that I had accepted the waiter's no as a stone wall when what I should have done is recognized it as the opening line in a negotiation. I should have said something like, "Mais monsieur, pourquoi?" Making room for a conversation to begin about how the food really was good, but I really couldn't have another bite, not right now. And then there is that new law and so on. If I had done that, I probably would have been able to walk away from the table with my food and still have left the waiter in a more or less good mood, because he would have enjoyed the back and forth of the conversation. One thing we might have discussed is whether or not this restaurant was subject to that law. The law is not universally applicable. It depends on certain specific factors such as size of the restaurant and so on. So that piece of wisdom from Barlow and Nadeau is something I will definitely try to remember from now on. And in fact, in other similar situations, I have been more successful in turning no into yes. So.
Merci. It is very complicated, I feel like. Hit the wrong button. I wanted to ask a question from that I know the Federation did too, but what has the French feedback been, or what do the French think of this book?
I was really nervous at first, before I had my first French review. I mean, I didn't write the book for French people. I wrote it for mainly Americans. It's mainly aimed at Americans, but really anybody who's not French, who speaks English. But everybody who's talked to me about it, and now there's a good handful of people who've read the book, French friends, and who have read the book and liked it, and so I was relieved and happy. What they've said most, I guess a few of them have said they thought it was funny. They said rigolant, which is good because I did try to write it in a very sort of lighthearted way, and made a few jokes. I mean, I guess I made a few jokes about the French. I certainly did it at least as much about Americans, I think. It's a very affectionate view of the French. It is strongly pro-French. So there's nothing really, there's no reason for people not to like it, but you never know. But yeah, the response has been good. I mean, people have told me, what else have they said? That one friend said that she, when she read the book, she realized there were certain things about her own personality that she had kind of thought were just her. And she didn't think of them as being French qualities, but she said, I guess maybe they are. Mm-hmm. And she's somebody who's in a professional career where she deals with internationally a lot and with Americans a lot. She said she thought it was going to be helpful to her in understanding Americans better. So that was nice to hear. But yeah, so it's been positive.
Did it make you think about Midwestern habits and traditions too?
Yeah, well, I mean, I that's where I grew up and that's who I am. And so in this one particular anecdote where I talk about, my default Midwestern response, yeah, I mean, that's something that I won't ever leave behind, and I don't want to really. That's who I am. But yes, I think, well, for me as a Minnesotan, the first big cultural adjustment I had to make was when I lived in New York City I lived in New York for 20 years, and New York, the culture in New York is very different there too. And so there was a certain adjustment there. I probably just as big, really, just different and in the same language, kind of.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I lived there too, and I remember my cousin telling me, New Yorkers are not unfriendly. It's just, can you imagine smiling at everyone who walked down the street in New York? And I was like, that, never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But Midwest is different. We have.
Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Nope. That's all. I was just going to say if Anne has a question or wanted to read a few from the chat too.
I had my own question and I can read some from the chat as well. So my question was, how would you compare living in a small town in France versus living in a small town in the US or in the Midwest?
Well, I've never done the latter. I've lived mainly in cities in the US. I've spent time in little towns in Minnesota, but always, as an outsider, really, as a city person coming there to spend some time. I mean, I've gotten enough of, I think many things are common to small rural communities. There is well, first of all, there's a suspicion of people from the city. And there's this aspect of life where there's very little anonymity. You know, in a small town, everybody knows everybody, and they know when somebody's not from there. And so I think that is probably almost is pretty much universal. So the comparison for me is more living in a city and living in a small village, and it's very different. It's very, very different. I never thought I would end up living in a small village. I loved living in New York, and you know, I love Minneapolis, and then I lived in Washington, D.C. for about 14 years before I came here. So it's been all urban, and there's many things I like about that. But at this point in my life, it's actually really nice to be here. I'm a writer. The thing that's great for me here is that it's quiet, and it's quiet, and there's not, I mean, there's plenty to do here and see and all that. And it's not that far from Paris. I like going to Paris often, but it's a good place to concentrate on one's work. And so it's offered me really that opportunity. And I've also, you know, found friendships here. And so, yeah, but that's the difference that I have to compare.
Great. Robert Rasmussen put in the chat, bonjour, if you wanted to move to France for a year, how would you start, and what would you recommend to ease the process?
Oh, well, I guess to start is there's a lot of research to be done. You have to find out, you know, what the process for the visa is. And because you said you want to come for like a year, is that what you said? Yeah. So that means you'll need a visa, because you can't stay in the EU really for longer than 90 days without a visa. And so you have to find out where you go to get that and what you need to produce to get it and all that. And then I think it depends, from there, it depends on what your own personal interests are, you know, where you think you want to be. And that would depend a lot on the individual. Easing the process, I don't know. It's not easy. It's not easy to deal with the bureaucracy. It can be very frustrating. And so I guess I can't really say that I can give advice to ease the process, other than starting well in advance and making sure that you know, leave time for everything. But I would say that you shouldn't let that keep you from doing what you want to do. Most people find there are frustrating moments in the process where they ask themselves, do I really want to do this? Is it really worth all this trouble? And I would say that it is. You know, if you really want to do it, it's worth doing whatever you have to do to make it happen. Do you know where you want to go in France?
Yeah, I was thinking of around Paris, so I had an opportunity to go to the museums at my own leisure instead of like on a tour. I've been there 4 times, and you know, you get an hour or whatever. It's just not enough time.
Absolutely.
And so be able to go when you want to go and that type of thing. Right.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to do. And you're right. I mean, Paris is so rich in museums, and any museum deserves more than an hour, and it deserves to be able to go back, many times. Because actually, at least for me, I can't actually spend much more than an hour in a museum. not always, but usually that's about enough for me. And so it sounds like what you want to do, to go and be in Paris for a year so that you can go back many times, is a wonderful plan. So I say go for it and don't be discouraged.
Nia also asked, have you
So,
read Peter Mail's A Year in Provence, and did it ring true to you?
I haven't read that book. I haven't read that book, although I certainly know about it. I haven't, I mean, I've read other books about, I guess I should just say, Peter Mail's, a lot of people really love his books. And then there are some people who are kind of turned off by them, because whether they're a French, I don't really know what French people think. I've never heard a French person who's read it, but I know a lot of Americans who live in France who have said that they felt like Peter Mail's was kind of laughing at he was kind of making fun of the villagers in the town where he lived. I can't speak to it because I haven't read the book, but I've heard that enough that it kind of made me not read it yet. Anyway, but I do know some other wonderful books that I've read and used in the classes that I teach in politics and prose. There's a book, and I would strongly recommend these. And I definitely identify with many of the experiences discussed by Jeffrey Green. He wrote a book called French Spirits. I think it's called, there's a subtitle, something, and a love affair in France. Jeffrey Green, who's a wonderful writer. He's a poet. And he's telling the story of how he and his wife bought this ancient presbytery in a little village in Burgundy, not far from here, actually. And he has a wonderful affection for the people, and he's been living there now for a long time. The book was published, I think, back in, I don't know, maybe not even before 2000. And it's a wonderful book, and definitely many of the experiences he talks about in there I identify with a lot. And then there's another American writer who has written a book called, well, he's written two books, actually. One of them is called, I think he's actually done Zoom events with you, maybe, with Milwaukee. Mark Greenside, has he? Yes. He wrote a book.
He was really funny and a great guy.
He's very funny, very, very funny, and a very good writer. And he writes about his experiences in this little village in Brittany, where he bought a home. And so there's, I'll never be French, no matter what I do. And then a couple of years ago, he came out with another one called Not Quite Mastering the Art of French Living. They're both wonderful. So those are the books that I really do recommend and identify with. And I can't really speak to the Peter Mail's because of what I said. Anyone else?
We have Marilyn asks,
Marilyn asks,
go ahead, Anne. I think there's some delay on either your side or mine.
okay. So Marilyn asks, how are the French handling the lockdowns culturally?
It's really hard for them. It's really, really hard. I mean, it's hard for everybody, I think. But I think it's particularly hard for the French because they're so social. And the big family dinners, the big family Sunday meals, for example, are really still a very ingrained and important part of French life. And they can't do it now. And it's been, I think we're in our third lockdown. I think it's a third one, third or fourth. And it's really hard for them for that reason. I think that it really is more of a challenge for French people than, for example, for Americans, because I think that they have cultural habits that we don't necessarily have, that are really challenged by this situation, and so they're having a hard time with it. It's the most recent one is supposed to lighten up on May 3rd. So everybody's looking forward to that and hoping it can last this time. But there were like, one of the things that little tidbits I saw in the news recently is that, you know, the French have, there's a code loi du travail or code du travail, the laws about workplace law. There are many, many, many rules. And one of them is apparently that that people are not supposed to eat at their desks. It's like, it's an actual rule that you're not supposed to eat at your desk in the workplace. The reason for that is that from a French point of view, that's just uncivilized behavior. It's unhealthy. It's not good for people. It's not a good way to enjoy your food. It's working too hard, all of that. And because of the situation with COVID, they recently, you know, said, okay, you know, for now it's okay. You can eat at your desk because people are not supposed to be eating together. But that's very counter to the whole French way of eating, of enjoying food. So yeah, it's hard.
Do you want to talk more about the town you're in, what it's like and how you wound up there?
Well, I came, do you have the slideshow handy to show quickly, or would you have to?
Yeah, I can probably.
You can maybe
give me
just
a minute.
yeah. Well, Esswa it's a really interesting little village. It's about halfway between, it's southeast of Paris, about 2.5 hours. It's about halfway between Troyes and Dijon. And it's closer to Troyes, but it's roughly halfway between those two cities. It's Champagne country. The main crop here is grapes, and sort of the whole rhythm of the year unfolds around that. With this freeze that we just had in France that destroyed a lot of the crop this year, which is really too bad. But so that's all part of the fabric of life here. But it's also an interesting place because it was the village that the Renoir family, that the famous painter, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, spent his summers here for many years. And then his daughter, not his daughter, his great-granddaughter actually. And Jean Renoir, the filmmaker, spent some of his so that's me, a long time ago. And I guess, do I have the ability to move this too? No.
Nope, it's just my screen, but I can.
Yeah, so no. So yeah, just flip ahead, I guess, to a few more slides. That's how I came to be there. I came to pick grapes in 1978. I had the opportunity to pick grapes. And that's, yeah. And then you can go ahead, and I'm trying to get to the pictures of Esswa. One more. Another one. Yeah, so here's Esswa. So this is Esswa on a summer evening. And then the next slide, Erin, well, the next slide is that one that she just showed you. Maybe we should go back to that. Actually, I went away from it too fast. So that's Esswa on a summer evening. That's right in the middle of the village. It's a beautiful little village. And then that's in summertime. The next slide will show you in the autumn. That's right outside my window. I'm actually on that kind of on the edge of the village. And that is a field that's just been tilled in the autumn. That field is used to grow wheat, rotating wheat and colza, which is the grain that's used to make canola oil. But you can see in the distance, not very well, I guess, but you can see in the distance that there are some vineyards up there in the hills, and they're surrounded by the beginnings of the Burgundian forest, really. And then the next slide, this is a mural of Jean Renoir, the filmmaker, as a baby. being held by his nanny, who was from Esswa. The reason that the Renoirs came to spend all this time here is because Madame Renoir was from Esswa, and this was and that other slide that you just showed.
Sorry.
That's the home, which has been restored. It was being used by the Renoir family, by the great granddaughter of the painter, until a few years ago. She spent her weekends and summers there, and then she sold the home to the village, and they embarked on a very ambitious plan to restore the home and open it to the public. And it's beautiful. It's really interesting to visit. So anyway, when you all get back to France, I hope you'll consider coming out this way, because it's a really interesting part of France, and it's not, there's lots to see and do here, but it's never really crowded like in some other parts of France. So it's a good place to put on your list, your itinerary. Other questions?
So I had a question is, you have two sons, maybe you have more children. What do your sons think of France and Esswa? Do they want to live there on a full-time basis, or?
Well, no, I mean, they're in their 20s, and they don't want to live here on a full-time basis now, but they love coming here. They absolutely love coming here. One of my sons is a absolute Francophile, and wants to live in France for sure, and is currently living in Paris and working as a journalist. My other son is not as much of a Francophile, but he likes being here. And and it looks like he's going to stay for a while too, because he just was able to get another job, a teaching assistantship. So he's in Lille, and he likes it there. He's not so sure he would want to live in France for good, but he's enjoying very much being here. And they both speak French really well, which pleases me.
And you touched on this a little bit. Do you want to talk about French food, the difference of the relationship with food in France and in the US?
Well, I think that first of all, the level of importance it has in the culture is important to know. Is important to recognize. Everything kind of revolves around food. The way the schedule of the day is arranged revolves around certain expectations. I mean, that which includes a nice long time to have lunch. Now, there's pressure on that French way of life from the global business environment, and I think it's somewhat being it's coming under pressure to some degree, but it's still, I mean, even in Paris, a lot of places close for lunch, and they don't close just for an hour. They close for, maybe a couple of hours, so that people, because that's what people think is necessary in order to have a good relaxing meal, in which is not just shoving food down your mouth and making sure you don't faint from hunger. It's about really enjoying the food and taking time. And it's not just the food, it's food plus conversation. When our kids were growing up, we tried to teach them that, because, they're Americans, and we'd get to the end, they'd finish their food and say, "Can I go now?" And we'd say, "No, no." And then I'd say, "A meal is food plus conversation," and they would roll their eyes. But that's kind of the biggest difference, I think, is the time that's taken, and also the care and interest, really, in fresh ingredients, in going from shop to shop, doing your shopping every day in little shops instead of the supermarket. All of that is also, kind of changing a little bit, but it's changing very slowly. And I think to the extent the French can hang on to that, I think, more power to them. I wish that we could be more like the French rather than that they would have to feel pressure to be more like us, because it's a very healthy and enjoyable way of living.
Mhm. And what are the specialties of Esswa, the gastronomical specialties other than champagne?
Well, the gastronomical specialty of Troyes is, oh shoot, I'm gonna blank out. This is impossible. I can't believe this. I'm blanking on the name, but it's a type of tripe, really. What is it? Andouillette.
Oh,
Andouillette,
okay.
Andouillette de Troyes. And I must say I have tried it, but I wasn't crazy about it. It's pretty strong. It's not the sort of thing that Americans tend to like necessarily. But
I've had, and I would say it's a stinky rubber band sausage.
yeah.
Of
And
what
she's
everybody-
French. Yeah, so that's, but of course, I feel very different about the fact that champagne is so free flowing in this part of the world. Whenever there's a little any kind of celebration in Esswa, and it's just a small village, it's only 750 people here. But when there's when there's the celebration at the 11 November for the Armistice Day, or the liberation of Europe, VE Day, all of these things. And then there's a little reception in the mairie after. There's always champagne. There's always champagne. And I love the champagne and all of the things that go with it. Of course, it's never just champagne. There's always all these little wonderful little aperitifs. And so I think those are, that is the most famous thing though, is the Andouillette de Troyes.
Do you want to talk about what some of the other chapters of your book address? I see in one, you talk about different views of money and the wealth between French and Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yes. There is a different, what did I call that one? I think I called it the relative unimportance of money. I think that a little bit goes along with what I was saying about food, actually, not directly, but I think that what can happen in the US, that it tends to happen that money and the need or the desire to earn as much as possible, as quickly as possible, can kind of interfere with the enjoyment of life. And the French are not that way. I think they have a healthier balance about these things, about the worth of something not always being about dollars. Of course, all Americans aren't that way, but the pressure of the sort of cultural pressure in the United States to be that way is strong. And so and it's not in France. That's one of the things that French people remark on when they go to the States, and they kind of can't believe how they're rushed out of restaurants. That doesn't happen in France. You don't have people looking over your shoulder or, sort of like practically pushing you out the door as soon as you finish your food. When you go into a French restaurant or a cafe or something, it's expected that you'll be able to sit there for as long as you want to, really, and enjoy your food, and then the conversation afterward. So yeah, they're not turning tables as quickly as if it happens in the United States. They're probably not making as much money, but they're enjoying their lives.
Well, and waiters don't depend on tips for their salary. A tip is much smaller.
Right.
So I'm assuming they're paid a little bit better than the service staff here. Wait
Yeah,
staff here.
that's a good point. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? I have a question for you all. What mystifies you about the French?
A good one, and you can either put it in the chat or wave at me or whatever, and I can unmute you. Everyone's thinking.
I guess one thing that for me is interesting and I still try to process is in France, there seem to be strict rules on food and other things, but there seems to be within those rules kind of a more relaxed way of living. And so I'm just wondering how that fits together.
Can you just say the last part? I mean, say it again so I can make sure I understand the question.
We just met with someone who bringing up Bebe, Pamela Druckerman, in that, you know, there are ways of raising your kids, which seems maybe there are rules that the Americans don't use, but the French American mothers seem more stressed out than French mothers. So there seems to be sort of more rules in France, but that somehow make life easier.
Right. I know what I know what you mean. And I know that book. It's a really good book, Bringing Up Bebe by Pamela Druckerman. I think what and what I recall, I read it when it first came out. And so it's quite a long time ago. But I think the point she was making, and I think it's a valid one, is that Americans kind of there's not this sort of standard way to be a parent in the United States. In the United States, we're all everybody's very individualistic. So there's this pressure for each person to find the most perfect way to parent. And in France, there's a kind of more of a consensus of how you're supposed to do it. Not just about child rearing, but about everything. There's pros and cons to both things. I mean, there's more freedom in the American system to, do things your way. But that also puts a kind of pressure. I think that's probably what you're referring to, Anne. It kind of puts a pressure on you to do it right. And there's no clear way to know if it's right or not. Whereas in France, you just do things the way you're comme il faut, as you're supposed to. And there's not all this anxiety about figuring out how to do it. You do it the way you're told, and that's that. So yeah, I think it's a kind of an interesting difference between the two cultures.
Yeah, and I think it goes well with, it goes also with food. If you're going to have a cocktail, there's kind of a code on what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So that takes some pressure off.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of that orderliness, which is one whole chapter in my book is about the importance of order, stability, and being correct. I think that it's both a limitation, but also within those boundaries, a certain kind of freedom, a different kind of freedom. Yeah.
There was I don't know if it's a comment or a question in the chat. I need to find it. Sorry, my system is a little slow. From Pauline. Yes. The importance of culture in daily life.
The importance of culture in daily life. Do you mean like arts and things like that? Yeah. I think that it's very important, generally speaking. And one of the ways you see that is, for example, when the museums open again, and Robert, who's going to be hopefully going over and spending a lot of time in Parisian museums, you'll see little young school children with their teachers, sometimes with their parents, being seated around a painting with their little notepads and drawing or discussing the artwork in a very serious way. And I think that it starts there. It starts there with this valuing of the arts, and teaching children to value them and showing them how to appreciate them. And it is kind of throughout the culture. It's not just something for artists or intellectuals or the wealthy or anything like that. It's really kind of built into the whole way of life in France. And I think it's a beautiful thing, really. I wish we could have more of it. But of course we can't on an individual level. When I teach my class during the summer and my students from New York are they're in Paris with me for a month, and then when it's time for them to go home, a lot of times they don't want to go. They do not want to go home. They like the way of living in Paris. They're excited about it, and they're New Yorkers, so they know that they're going back to a place that is very much more rushed and hurried than Paris is. And but I just always tell them, well, you're not going to change New York. You're not going to change the country, but you can change your own lives. You can take what you've learned here and work it into your own lives to a certain degree. And so, yeah.
And Stepanka is asking, or is mentioning French music. Why is it so unique and different? For example, you have artists like Beko, Aznavour, and many women singers.
I don't know. Well, I know Aznavour, the name. My favorite French singer is Georges Brassens, who is a wonderful poet, really, and songwriter and singer. I think that there's an interesting. There's a book called WTF ? What the French, by Olivier Magny. He's a young Frenchman. And he wrote a book all about, sort of explaining all these different things about French culture primarily for, I think, an American audience. I think his wife is American. And he has a wonderful little chapter all about French songwriting. And one of the things he says is that he thinks that it's really sung poetry. A lot of French music is sung poetry, and that the richness is there. And so that's such a big part of it, that maybe it's part of why people who don't know French don't appreciate it as much. But I think that that's one of the rich rich things about French songwriting. I don't really know a lot about it, about different artists, but there are a few that I really love to listen to. And Georges Brassens is one.
Erin, do you want to read your question?
Sure. Sorry, it was noisy here for a second. Do you want to just talk about the concept of flâner and what it says about the French culture?
Yeah, well, that kind of fits into what we were talking about taking your time, and which is one of the chapters, the importance of taking your time. Flâner is, for anybody who maybe doesn't know, it really means, well, it can mean to stroll in one sense of the word, but that's a very narrow definition of, my favorite definition of flâner is by Harriet Welty Rochefort, who in one of her books, she said that to be a flâneur is It's the art of hanging out without feeling guilty. Which goes back to that same thing about the French. That's the thing. The French do not feel like it's a waste of time to sit in a cafe for a couple of hours and watch the world go by and chat with their friends or read or whatever. It's an important part of their life to be able to do that. They're not worried about being productive necessarily in that way. They are extremely productive. In many ways, but it doesn't have to be always this rush and this product-oriented way of being. So yeah, that's my favorite definition of it. It's the not feeling guilty that is probably equally important to taking the time. Because if you're going to take time to sit somewhere, but just feel guilty about the fact that you're doing it, it kind of defeats the purpose. So.
Well, last call for questions. And my last one is, do you want to talk about your new project? You're writing a book about Iowa or a memoir?
I'm writing a memoir that is called A Long Way from Iowa. And the reason it's called A Long Way from Iowa is because that the story begins in 1892. That is my grandmother was born in a very small town in northeastern Iowa. And both my grandmother and my mother, I think both really loved to travel, and did a certain amount of it, as much as they could. And both really loved to read. And I think they both kind of would have liked to be able to be writers. And it was their passion for the written word and for storytelling that they passed on to me. And I feel like in some ways I was the third generation, the person in that chain who was able to actually make a life of writing. And so that's where the story begins. And I tell a lot about my grandmother's life, and then about my mother's, and then mine. And I've been working on it for a long time, and I'm probably still going to be working on it for a while. It keeps changing. But yeah, that's the book. But I should mention before, Erin had asked me to tell people where you can buy the book. Here's the book. And you can buy it lots of different places, but I guess there's a wonderful indie bookstore in Milwaukee that Erin said I should mention. It's the Boswell Books.
Yep,
right?
Boswell Book Company.
And I did check to see if they have the book. They have it back ordered, which means they're waiting for it, I guess. And so if you want to buy it from them, you can I'm sure you can just call them and just say that, ask to be put on the list. There's also a link to my website that I think goes straight to the Demystifying the French page. And there you'll see where you can, if you don't want to buy, you can also buy it as an ebook. And there's different places you can buy it from as an ebook. So all that information is there. So I hope some of you will buy the book. I hope you will enjoy it. I hope you, whatever your dreams are about getting to France or getting back to France, I hope they will come true very soon. Because France wants you to come back too.
And Mary asked or said, I'm in Des Moines. What is the name of your Iowa town?
Bonaire. Which is actually, it's a French name. It wasn't pronounced in a very French way, Bonaire. But it's not even really a town anymore. It's there. I've been there. It's near Cresco, which is in the northeastern corner of the state.
Okay. Well, merci beaucoup for joining us. And
merci à vous
contact
pour avoir pris ce temps.
Janet's book.
Merci tout le monde.
Merci,
Merci
Janet.
beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Au revoir.
Bye.